Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Outside the Box video. Well, I teased this the other day when it comes to the newest character that I'm going to talk about for this series, and it has to do with yet another supporting character that, at least to me, left a lasting impression within the film he was in. So as always, when it comes to these videos, I'm just going to talk about the character, who they are, what they did, why did they do it, what happened to them, and then most importantly, what would have happened if things changed within the film itself. Like, let's say if circumstances were different than what we saw in the film, then what would have happened to the character. Those are always my favorite part because I get to be able to then discuss a whole new universe of things, at least in my opinion. And then, of course, followed by a little bit of trivia. And it has to do with this character here. So you've seen the film. I'm sure you have. I have. I've seen it plenty of times. Still a favorite of mine, Alien 3. And it has to do with the doctor associated with it, or the medical professional associated with it, by the name of Jonathan Clemens. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information, all the trivia, everything associated with this character from the Alien franchise. So who was this Jonathan Clemens? Well, for starters, he was someone that was played by the actor known as Charles Dance. You're looking at him now, in fact. He's one of those actors that you've seen in so many films, and yet if you try to name his name, it would give you pause. It's one of those situations where it's you think about it and you're like, oh wait, he's that guy from dot dot dot, and then you realize all of a sudden that he has like a library of films to reference. You just can't remember his name. So he's most likely known as a character actor, meaning he makes very memorable impressions when it comes to his roles. Too many films to list here. Obviously, Alien 3 being one of my favorite, but he also is in the brilliant, and in this case short-sighted, like the ones that, it's something like a cult classic by now, Last Action Hero, playing the villain or the main villain within that film. I love that film too. In fact, I was debating about talking about his character in that film or this one, but I like Alien 3 far more, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about him here instead. But who knows, I might leave it up there afterward. But yes, going back to the character itself, let's talk about that. So Jonathan Clemens, he was essentially the medical officer located there in Fiorina 161, otherwise known as Fury 161. Although, interestingly enough, other designations for the planet have also been noted in comics and also in other films, Alien 4 or Alien Resurrection to be exact. So he was someone that was stationed there almost like first on a non-military basis, like non-voluntary, and then now being on a voluntary basis. So he was someone that was the medical officer for a tiny, tiny group of inmates there. I mean, you've seen the movie. You know how many inmates have been there. Probably less than, let's say, 2 dozen or so. And he was the only one there fit to be able to examine them, to provide treatments, to basically be the medical officer. I can't remember, though, if he truly was designated a doctor. I don't think so, because of a situation that I'll explain here in a minute. But for all intents and purposes, he was their doctor there. And he was someone that basically started the whole movie, because he was the one that discovered Ripley's capsule, whatever it was, careening down, in this case, the actual planet, and witnessing it. Imagine if for a second he didn't see that while he was traveling outside, like wherever he was. If that were the case, then Ripley's capsule would have just hit the water, and then probably would have found, gone back onto the beach as it shows within the film, but it would have never been found. And then lo and behold, her body and everything else associated within the capsule, all the other bodies, would have been eaten by the tiny, tiny, let's say, animals, organisms that are found there. By the way, some of this information I'm going to derive from the Alien 3 novelization, which I heavily love as well. It's one of those novels that I read at least once every year, and I listen to the audiobook too, because it contains so much rich information outside of the film itself. But yes, if he hadn't have found that capsule, then her body, the rest of the bodies there, the capsule itself would have just been laid there dormant on Fury 161, never to be found, and then her body would have probably just been eaten as is by those tiny, tiny organisms. In fact, the novel states that by the time he found her, there were already a multitude of organisms on her body. That's how quickly the animals or the organisms are there on Fury 161. It is such a hardcore planet that anything that's considered food is just eaten and stripped alive within moments, within a short time period. But he found her body, he found her capsule, and that's what set things in motion for the film itself. He brought her on board to the facility, and then he was able to try to treat her as she came to. And then, of course, everything else led from that. The discovery of the capsule, the discovery of the EEV, I believe is the correct designation. The egg that's inside it, in this case, the alien that was able to implant itself within different versions, like in this case, the movie being the dog, and then in the novel and the script being a giant ox, and then, of course, laying birth to the alien itself. But all of it essentially came from him. So interesting to think the twist that might have occurred if he didn't do that. And what did he do there on the actual planet, on the facility? Again, he was the medical officer there. I hinted at this just a minute ago. He seems to be there on a voluntary basis, and the reason for it is this. Beforehand, he used to be an inmate. It was a rather tragic situation. He explained it within the movie. The novel goes into more detail, but he was someone that was in the medical field, like he was someone that was in school for it, and he was considered to be someone within one of the top percentage of his class. I think I remember him saying, if not in the novel, it was in the movie, 5% of his class. So very, very high standard when it comes to that. He was someone that absolutely was going to have a pretty good career. And whenever he graduated, he was placed into some kind of residency. That's that part of medicine where after you've graduated, you kind of spend, I think, is it still 2 or 3 years out there on the field under training. Probably the closest thing to internship when it comes to the medical field, but in this case, it's much more hands-on. You have to deal with so many shifts. You have to deal with day-by-day situations. Clearly, books can only go so far. That's why the residency is the main thing. It allows people to be able to experience the real deal up close and personal, and in that way they get to learn from it. These students that are within the residency are able to then become true to their field, true masters of their field, and then be able to graduate from that residency as full-blown doctors. Plus, the residency kind of like weeds things out too. So again, books only go so far. So those that think that they can just hack it, and then they go out there in the real world, and suddenly they're in the hospitals, they're in community care centers, they're in places that suddenly they're dealing with hard pressure type stuff. If they can't hack it, then it's found out, and it's much better that way, so that way they're not accidentally treating things badly afterward. But as tragedy beholds, this was where Jonathan Clemens' life completely changed during a particular shift. In fact, he stated in the movie it was some kind of mining explosion. It caused a sudden flurry of, I think it was a mining or boiler, I can't remember, but it caused a sudden flurry of patients in the hospital that he was at. So he was there, again, using all of his talents, his promising abilities to be able to treat them, but he was doing so in a much longer shift. In fact, he stated somewhere along the lines of a 36-hour straight shift of doing so. Everybody marveled at what he could do. Like, they were saying, wow, in this case, Clemens is able to do all of this and continue to be strong even after working so many hours. But it turns out it's because he never mentioned it to anybody, but he suffered from an addiction. In this case, it was more on the lines of a morphine addiction. That caused him to have that little pep in his step, but it caused him afterward to do bad things. Not necessarily through his fault directly, but indirectly because of the condition he put himself into. So because he was addicted to morphine and because he put so much of it into himself during that shift, eventually it caused him to create mistakes in the type of treatments that he was giving. So In one case, he prescribed, and this is the fatal case, a wrong dose of painkillers to a lot of patients. And it turns out that 11 of those people that were within that mine or boiler explosion ended up passing away because of his bad prescription. So it goes to show how important it is to stay focused within the medical field, because the tiniest infraction could cause serious harm to people, or in this case, cause the deaths of all these people. Of course, there was too little too late. These people were dead. 11 people out of those casualties were all directly related to him. So he was found guilty of doing this type of infraction. He was sentenced to 7 years at least within Fury 161. He stated that he should have gotten longer, but he still was able to then serve it there. But he served it, and then afterward he decided to stay, kind of like as a practical purpose, because no one else truly was going to hire him. That's the reason why he stayed there at that location, because he felt that there was a need for him, because of his blemish on his records, because of obviously the big tragedy that he had, the big mistake that he did in his prescriptions. Nobody would ever touch him. But Weyland-Yutani, the corporation, still saw a need for him. No doubt they probably saw it as a money factor too, because here they could hire him at a fraction of the cost, knowing that they have him more as a captive audience, and then that way he can serve the company, serve Fury 161, serve the prisoners there, keep himself within some kind of profession, tied to what he originally wanted to do. All that's left, though, is him doing it probably at a fraction of the cost, and knowing that there's nothing else he can really do afterwards. So a broken man is probably the closest thing to mention when it comes to Jonathan Clemens. Somebody that had so much promise, so much potential, but having that addiction and then not doing anything about it, leading to those infractions and those accidental deaths. All of it just led to where his current state is. And that's, of course, where the movie starts off, with him essentially being out there and then finding the capsule. The extended edition goes into further details, too, when it comes to him finding Ripley's castle. In fact, it highlights his personality, his traits. There's more on the lines of him being an isolated person, someone that just likes to be by themselves, that just goes out there, and when he can, the novel highlights this, whenever there's more on the lines of weather that's easier to handle, then he goes out there outside of the prison and likes to wander around just thinking to himself. He's definitely an isolationist. This kind of comes into play with several of the other characters, and I'll highlight that in a minute too. But what happened to him in the film afterward? Well, you saw it, I saw it. Eventually he was killed by the alien, and it was a straight up headshot, about probably the quickest, easiest, painless way to go, albeit a moment of sheer terror leading up to it for a couple of seconds. But otherwise, he was eventually found by the alien as he was trying to treat Ripley, and when that happened, then the alien just grabbed him. No chance for him at all to escape, considering the sheer strength that the dog alien had. And then that was it, just one clean headshot, classic headshot, and then he was able to be disposed of. There's a very quick shot too. It's kind of like a blink and you miss type thing, but it shows that the dog alien took his body up to the vent. So eventually his body would have been just alien food thereafter, because it's one of the few films, I think the only one, that kind of shows an alien eating from the corpses themselves. I don't recall one of the other films showcasing it. If someone does know, please post it in the comments. But he eventually became alien food. So not even an honorable death, not even something where he could be buried. No, in this case, he probably would have been eaten completely and no trace of him found thereafter. Not necessarily that Weyland-Yutani or anyone else would have cared about him afterward too. It's not like when the Weyland-Yutani crew came in towards the end of the film, and then afterward, if they were trying to see what happened, if they would have cared about the doctor. So essentially he would have been written off in history as is within the prison, dying there, and then nobody would have come back and found out of more information about him. So kind of a way to go when you think about it. It's kind of like a bleak way to go, but it ties into his bleak life as well. Now here's the interesting part. What would have happened if nothing occurred? Like, what would have happened to his character? First, let's go under one pretense, and that has to do with this. Suppose, let's say he lived the alien encounter, past the alien encounter. So somewhere along the way, instead of getting hit by that headshot, let's say he was able to survive survive, and then was able to be picked up by Weyland-Yutani. In my opinion, I think that eventually he still would have been killed. Clearly, the films have shown by now that everyone that Weyland-Yutani encounters, unless they're considered very important, they are crew expendable. They're very famous scenes associated with that. So here they are facing a situation where you have an intelligent character like Jonathan Clemens, the doctor in this case, from the prison. There he is living. He knows information about the alien. He knows what occurred. He knows about Ripley. He's using his intelligence to try to figure all of this out. Always prodding for more information. I think then eventually they would have done something about him, especially considering, again, how tiny his life is compared to the big picture. Here he was someone that was just completely just abandoned by the medical field, working in an off planet like this, an off-world planet, a backworld planet like Fury 161. Nobody would have cared about him. Nobody absolutely would have come calling and asked, what happened to Jonathan Clemens? Why isn't he around? No family that I know of. He didn't have a wife or any kids. No other mention associated with other family as well. So for all intents and purposes, it would have been much easier for Weyland-Yutani to take care of business when it came to witnesses. So they probably would have prodded him for as much information as he knew about the encounter, about what occurred there on Fury 161, leading up to the death of Ripley. So they probably would have gotten as much information as they could, and then that's it. They would have taken care of him. In the bleakness of space, traveling so many miles between where that ship originally came from, the Weyland-Yutani ship, and then landing there, going back, they would have eventually done something to him. It makes sense, doesn't it? That would have been at least my opinion as to what occurred to him. But let's say there was no alien at all. Like, let's say nothing happened. Let's say Ripley's capsule or EEV landed on the complete other side of the planet. So he would have never found the capsule itself. In my opinion, I think Jonathan Clemens would have just continued as the medical doctor or the medical officer up until he died, really, because it seems like that was his point in his life there. He was just a servant to the prison. Like, he needed the prison as much as they needed him. It was almost like they were both chained to each other as much as he hated it, because again, he would have had nothing else he could have done anywhere else, any other planet, any other location, nothing. So I think he would have just continued his mundane life, going in and out of the prison, just treating the people there, seeing new prisoners, seeing past prisoners go, maybe even seeing some of them die along the way. He just would have stayed there probably until old age, and then that's it, again, to be forgotten completely afterward. But that's my opinion, again, when it comes to that. Imagine if there was no alien, no encounters, nothing at all. He just would have continued as is. Now for a little bit of trivia associated with Jonathan Clemens. So originally he was a different character within the myriad of scripts that Alien 3 had. Alien 3 is famous for having so many scripts. It went through so many writers. Eventually it landed to the script that we saw in the film. So his character is a mishmash of two characters, one being another medical officer that was in one of the scripts, and then the other one being a quote-unquote brother, like in this case somebody from a religious sector that was within one of the other scripts. Both of them within the scripts ended up finding Ripley within whatever it was she landed in. So everything was merged. It was kind of like formed together to be this guy, this character, and that's where essentially he came from. Another interesting to note about Jonathan Clemens, and I mentioned this a little earlier, he's truly the only intelligent, like probably the most intelligent character that human in this case that the alien encountered. There's a difference between smart and intelligent. He's definitely more book smart. Like, he's definitely somebody that is truly like putting pieces together all along the way, always prodding, always trying to find out more info. It ties into the tense situation he had with the superintendent. That was because the superintendent clearly saw him as an equal when it came to things mentally, and he was always, like in this case, Jonathan Clemens, always trying to push things further. Like, he was trying to bypass rules, or he was trying to find the new things that he could do that the superintendent necessarily didn't say you can't do, but at the same time he's not asking permission for it. So that's why he was kind of like somebody that was a little different in the alien lore, because here you had somebody that was very intelligent, top 5% in this case of his entire class, somebody that was able to use tiny bits of information to slowly piece things together, whatever Ripley was telling him in the film, and slowly realizing what was occurring up until the obviously the last point when he saw the alien and everything just came into place. Unfortunate for him, but it still shows that he's no match at all for the alien. I like how the film highlighted that in some ways, because in the first film it was all about blue collar workers and they were no match for the alien. And then the second film it was all about grunts. It was all about military personnel from all walks of life, and they were still no match for the alien. In this case, it has to do with the prisoners who aren't necessarily that intelligent themselves. At least the films didn't portray them as way, but he was, and he was no match from it. In fact, to show you how intelligent he was, the novel highlights it. He was able to piece together just from the hospital parts there a bunch of things to create his own distillery. So he was able to create his own alcohol. It was fascinating when I was reading that in the novel, because that's not something that one just is able to do easily. So it goes to show what he's able to do with just a small amount of parts, especially with the limited resources there within the prison. And then about the only thing to highlight with Jonathan Clemens is he was mentioned probably I think just once within the other Alien franchise, and it has to do with a short story. I think it's called Deep Black, something like that. That was within one of the novels. But that's it. Apparently, his character just hasn't been that important within the Alien franchise thereafter. Not mentioned anywhere else, not even in the video games, because there was a huge amount of video games that came out with Alien 3, both on the SNES, the Genesis, Game Boy, the arcade game, a computer game if I'm not mistaken, and probably some others that I still left out. And his character was never listed there. The only other place I've ever seen his character placed besides the movie happens to be the novel, and then also the Alien 3 comic book. So nothing else other than that short story that I mentioned too, but he's still a fan favorite of mine, and I'm sure that there are others that like his character too. So but Charles Dance definitely made it a very memorable impression when it came to portraying Jonathan Clemens. One final thing, just as a bonus that I wanted to add too, one of Alien 3 remains my favorite because of the environment. I love Furina or Fury 161. It's so bleak, it's so desolate, so large. It's almost like going there and just seeing nothing, and yet it's still so fascinating, especially the prison within it. Imagine the novel goes into detail that the prison itself is about 22 kilometers large. Imagine that. You can be walking down corridors the entire day and you'll never reach the end of them. Just endless tunnels, endless hallways, these twists and turns, tiny pockets of space within each hallway that you can just settle down. And in the middle of this entire abyss, just listen and listen for nothing. So I love that kind of stuff. It just sticks with me whenever I see that kind of desolate, minimalist type stuff. So in this case, I love Alien 3 because of the environments there associated with Furina 161. So, all right, everybody. If anybody has any more info about Jonathan Clemens, please let me know. Oh yeah, one last thing that I'll mention. He was, it seems like, at least from the prisoner standpoint, somebody that they liked, because he could have treated them bad. Like, he was someone, again, that was leagues above them in terms of intelligence. He could have been snooty, he could have been rude, he could have been somebody that just completely just dismissed them, but for all intents and purposes, the prisoners seemed to like him because he just didn't do that. He obviously was at odds with the superintendent and then his subordinates, but as far as the prisoners, he was someone that they were satisfied having there. That's why it ties into what would have happened to him if nothing occurred from the movie itself. I think he just would have stayed there forever. It ties into that too. So, well, all right, everybody. Thanks again as always. I look forward to the next Outside the Box video soon. I already have another character in mind that I think you're going to love too. So, all right, everybody. Take care.